She was 41 years old, and she had $9 to her name, folded twice and pressed flat against her palm like something that might fly away if she loosened her grip. Her name was Adeline Marsh, and 3 weeks before that cold October morning in 1889, her brother-in-law had stood in the doorway of the house she had helped build with her own 2 hands and told her the deed had never carried her name, only his, and that a widow with no children and no proof of her labor had no claim on anything inside those walls. He said it kindly enough, the way men say cruel things when they want to believe themselves decent. And then he closed the door, and Adeline stood on the porch she had painted herself, listening to the latch fall, and understood that she owned nothing in the world but the clothes on her back and whatever coins were sewn into her hem. She walked 11 miles to the town of Coldwater Junction with those $9, and when the auctioneer's boy called out the last lot of the day, a burnt-out, wind-stripped stagecoach depot on the edge of town, abandoned since the rail line bypass of a decade before. The men around her laughed when she raised her hand and offered $6 for a building nobody else wanted enough to bid against her. They laughed harder when she paid it. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that bolted into the floor of that ruined depot's back office sat an old iron safe, and inside that safe waited a letter sealed in wax nearly 20 years untouched, a letter that would not only change the shape of Adeline's own life, but would return to an entire town something it had quietly grieved and never spoken of aloud. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a town passed over, a home that no longer feels like yours, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read everyone. Adeline had been born in 1848 in a river town in southern Ohio, the second daughter of a wheelwright named Elias Marsh, a man who believed that a thing broken was simply a thing waiting to be understood better than it had been the first time it was built. Her mother, Ruth, kept the books for her father's shop, a rare thing for a woman of that place and time, and it was from her mother that Adeline learned her letters and her figures before she learned to properly braid her own hair. The wheelwright shop stood at the corner of River Road and 2nd Street, and Adeline spent her childhood among the smell of hot iron and cut oak, watching her father run his hands along a wagon wheel where another man might study a face, feeling for the floor before his eyes ever found it. He used to tell her that most people threw away twice what they needed to, because they had never been taught to look past the first layer of a thing. A cracked axle was not a dead axle. A warped spoke was not a wasted spoke. Everything holds more use than its first appearance grants it, he would say, running a thumb along a seam of old wood. You simply have to be patient enough and humble enough to look. Adeline carried that lesson the way other children carried scripture, and it shaped the woman she became. Careful, watchful, slow to discard and slower still to despair. Her mother taught her something else, something quieter but no less important. Ruth Marsh had grown up poor in a Pennsylvania coal town, one of 9 children, and she never forgot what it felt like to be looked past, to be the kind of person whose hardship the world found convenient to ignore. She raised Adeline to notice those people. When traveling families came through with hollow-cheeked children, Ruth always found bread to spare, even in lean seasons. When a freedman named Thomas Coyle set up a small forge 2 streets over and half the town refused to patronize him, Ruth walked over herself with a broken kettle and paid him double what the men was worth, and told her daughter that a community was only as strong as its willingness to see people others refused to see. Adeline absorbed this too, without knowing yet how directly it would return to her, decades later, in a town she had not yet heard of. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, steady man named Peter Halloway, a surveyor who worked for the railroads as they crept westward through the 1860s and 1870s, and for a time her life took on the rhythm of that expansion. Town after town, canvas tents and half-built depots, the smell of creosote and fresh-cut ties. Peter died of a fever in 1874, leaving her without children and without much money, and she went to live with her late husband's brother, Warren Halloway, and his wife, in the town of Coldwater Junction, a modest railroad settlement in the high plains that had, at the time, seemed to have a future ahead of it. For 15 years Adeline kept house for Warren's family, cooked, mended, tended a garden that fed half the street in bad years, and helped Warren build the very house she would later be turned out of, laying floorboards herself when the hired carpenter took ill, because she had never forgotten her father's hands on old wood and had, without ever intending to, become someone who understood construction better than most men who called it their trade. She asked for nothing beyond a roof and a place at the table. She believed, foolishly perhaps, that 15 years of unpaid labor and loyalty constituted a kind of ownership that the law did not recognize but decency should have. He was a frightened one, and fright makes cowards of men who might otherwise have been merely weak. The truth, which Adeline did not learn until later, was that Warren had gambled away money against the house itself, borrowed against a deed his own brother had left in trust for Adeline's use, and when the debt came due he needed the house entirely in his name to satisfy the men he owed. It was easier, in the moment, to tell himself a story where his brother's widow had no true claim, easier still to say it kindly and call it necessity rather than betrayal. He gave her 3 days to gather her things. His wife, Cora, would not meet Adeline's eyes as she packed the single trunk she was permitted to take, though she did slip $2 extra into Adeline's coat pocket when Warren was not looking, a small mercy that Adeline would remember for the rest of her life, proof that even inside a household capable of cruelty, some tenderness survived. And so, at 41, Adeline Marsh Halloway walked out of the only home she had known for 15 years with a trunk, $9, and a particular clarity that comes to people who have lost everything and discovered, to their own surprise, that they are still standing. She did not go far. Coldwater Junction was the only town she knew, and pride, or perhaps simple exhaustion, kept her from writing to her sister back in Ohio to beg for shelter. She took a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Sarah Pruitt, paid for 3 nights in advance, and spent those nights walking the town at dusk, trying to imagine what a woman with almost nothing could possibly build for herself in a place that had already decided who she was. It was on the second of those nights that she passed the old Stagecoach depot on the eastern edge of town, and stopped, the way she used to stop at her father's shop before a piece of broken wood, feeling for what others had missed. The depot had been built in 1866, when Coldwater Junction still believed the coach lines would matter alongside the rails, a handsome 2-story building of fieldstone and timber with a wide loading porch and tall windows, now boarded and broken by a decade of neglect once the railroad's own depot made it obsolete. Local boys had stripped it of anything valuable long ago. A fire, some years back, had blackened one corner of the roof. Most of the town considered it an eyesore, a place fit only for pigeons and the occasional vagrant sleeping out of the weather. The town council had tried twice to sell it and failed both times, and now, apparently, it was to be auctioned off for whatever it might bring, if anything, alongside a handful of other unclaimed properties and unpaid debts. Adeline stood in front of it for a long while in the fading light, running her eyes over the stonework the way her father used to run his thumb over a seam, and something in her recognized not ruin but neglect, which she understood, from a lifetime of experience, to be an entirely different condition. Bones were bones. A roof could be mended. Stone did not rot. She thought of her father's voice, patient and low. Everything holds more use than its first appearance grants it. She thought, too, though she could not have said why, that a building nobody wanted might be the only kind of thing left in the world that a woman with $9 could still hope to claim. The auction was held 3 days later on the courthouse steps, a cold, bright morning with frost still silvering the grass, and the depot came up last, as the least desirable lot of the day, after farm equipment and a widow's parcel of unworked land and a set of harness tools nobody wanted either. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Cyrus Bell, read the description with visible boredom, called for an opening bid, and was met with silence, then laughter, when Adeline Halloway, standing at the edge of the small crowd in her plain gray dress, raised her hand and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, $6. A man near the front, a rancher named Otis Grady who fancied himself the wit of every gathering he attended, called out that she'd want to save the other 3 for the undertaker once the roof finished falling in on her, and the crowd laughed again, and Cyrus Bell, seeing no other bidders and wanting his dinner, brought the gavel down with a kind of contemptuous swiftness, as though settling the matter of a joke rather than a sale. $6, sold to the widow Halloway, and God help her. She paid it in coin, counting out each piece carefully under Cyrus Bell's impatient eye, and took the folded deed he handed her with hands that did not shake, though everything inside her did. She had $3 left in the world and the keys, such as they were, to a ruin that even the town's own council had been glad to be rid of. She walked to the depot alone that afternoon, let herself in through the sagging back door, and stood in the dust-moted silence of the main hall, looking up at the water-stained ceiling and the broken counter where tickets had once been sold to travelers heading toward futures that had never quite arrived, and she felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was not despair. It was smaller than hope. It was closer to purpose. She spent that first evening simply walking the building room by room with a stub of candle, cataloging damage the way her father had taught her to catalog a wagon's wounds, not with dismay but with an inventory of what remained sound. The main hall was salvageable. The upstairs rooms, once used for the depot agent's lodging, had suffered water damage, but the framing held true. It was in the small back office, behind the ticket counter, that she found the safe. It sat bolted to the floor in the corner beneath a fallen shelf, an iron box the size of a large trunk, its black paint chipped, its brass dial gone dull with grime, and she knelt before it a long while, brushing away cobwebs, feeling the same old thrill her father used to feel prying open a wheel hub to see what secrets of wear and rot lay inside. She had no way to open it that night, no tools beyond a small knife, and so she banked what little fire she could manage in the office hearth, wrapped herself in a coat, and slept on the floor of her own depot for the first time, safe in a way she had not felt in 3 weeks, whatever the safe itself might hold. It took her 4 days to find a way into it. She could not afford a locksmith, and pride kept her from asking the town for charity so soon after its laughter, so she did what her father had done with every stubborn mechanism he ever met. She studied it. She found, wedged behind a loose board in the depot agent's old lodging room upstairs, a leather ledger book, swollen with damp, its pages fused at the edges but still legible enough near the center, and in it, in the careful hand of a man who signed himself only as J. Thorne, agent, she found reference to the safe's combination, written in a private code of dates that took her the better part of an evening to untangle, dates that turned out to correspond not to any obvious calendar but to the birthdays of the agent's own children, listed elsewhere in the ledger's early pages among notes of freight and passenger counts. When the final tumbler fell into place on the 5th night, and the heavy door swung open with a groan of long-rusted hinges, Adeline found herself looking not at gold, not at cash, but at a single sealed envelope resting atop a stack of yellowed papers, the wax seal unbroken, addressed in a firm hand to whoever should one day open this safe in good faith. She did not open it immediately. She sat back on her heels in the dust and candlelight and simply held it, feeling the strange, private gravity of a message that had waited perhaps 20 years for a stranger's hands, and it was only after she had steadied her breathing that she broke the seal and began to read. The letter was dated the 14th of March, 1869, and it was written by the very J. Thorne whose ledger she had already deciphered, the last agent to serve the Cold War to Junction Stagecoach depot before the rail line's arrival made the coach route obsolete and the depot's fortune collapsed almost overnight. Thorne wrote with a careful, formal cadence of an educated man trying to compress an urgent truth into the smallest possible space, and what Adeline read by candlelight that night altered the entire shape of what she believed she had bought for $6. Thorne explained that in the depot's final profitable years, before the rail company's tracks reached the valley, the stage line had served as an informal bank for a dozen or more homesteading families scattered through the surrounding hills, families too distant from any proper bank to trust their meager savings to a long ride over dangerous country, and too wary, after the Panic of 1857, to trust banks at all. Thorne, known and respected by these families, had agreed to hold their savings in the depot's safe for a modest fee, recording each family's deposits meticulously in a separate ledger, a practice that had continued quietly for nearly 6 years. Then the rail line came. The coach traffic collapsed within a single season. The depot's income vanished, and Thorne himself fell gravely ill that same winter, a fever that the letter suggested he did not expect to survive. Fearing he would die before he could properly return the deposits, and with the depositing families scattered across hard country and difficult to summon quickly, Thorne had sealed the letter, along with a full accounting ledger of every family's savings, inside the safe itself, trusting that whoever eventually took possession of the depot in good faith would see the debt honored, rather than let it vanish into the ground with him. He listed the families by name. He listed the sums, modest by any grand measure, $10 here, 30 there. A widow's $42 saved a coin at a time, but sums that, in 1869, represented years of a family's careful sacrifice, sums that with 2 decades accrued interest, as Thorne had specified should be added if the debt were ever honored late, now totaled a figure that made Adeline's hands tremble as she added the columns a second time to be certain she had not erred. Thorne, it turned out, had not died that winter after all, though the town believed him gone. Adeline learned this only later, piecing it together from town records and the memories of older residents, too weak to manage the depot any further, too ashamed of a debt he could not immediately settle. Thorne had quietly left Cold Water Junction that same spring, moved east to live with a widowed sister in Missouri, and never returned, perhaps assuming in the confusion of his illness and the depot's abrupt failure, that someone would attend to the safe, or perhaps simply carrying a private, unresolved guilt for the rest of his days that he had never found the courage to make right from a distance. The depot had passed through the hands of the rail company, then reverted to the town for unpaid taxes, then sat empty and forgotten for 2 decades, its safe undisturbed, its dead unspoken, because no one left in Cold Water Junction had known it existed at all. The families had not forgotten. Over the following days, as Adeline began asking careful, quiet questions around town, always framed as simple curiosity about the depot's old history, she began to understand the shape of what the town itself had buried alongside Thorne's departure. Several of the families named in the ledger still lived in the county. The Pruitts, her own landlady's late husband's people, had lost $18 and never spoke of. A sum that might have kept their farm through a hard winter had instead nearly lost them. The Eklunds, a Swedish family up near Miller's Creek, had lost $30 saved toward a second plow horse, and old Nils Eklund, now 81 and half-blind, still told his grandchildren, with a bitterness that had calcified into family legend, that the stage company had robbed him and vanished, a story his grandchildren had grown up believing as unquestioned fact. A woman named Delphine Ruiz, whose mother Concepcion had deposited $42, the largest single sum in the ledger, had grown up in genuine hardship after her mother's early death, hardship that town gossip had always quietly, unfairly attributed to some failing of Concepcion's own rather than to a debt the town itself had let vanish into an old iron box. The town had not merely lost a depot. It had lost, in a slow, unspoken way, a piece of its own trust in itself, a wound that had healed over crooked, the way Adeline's father used to describe a bone that mended without being properly set, still functional, still bearing weight, but never quite right, and everyone who leaned on it feeling a dull ache they had long since stopped questioning. Adeline understood, sitting alone in the depot's back office with Thorne's ledger spread before her, that she now held something far larger than a discovery. She held a decision. The law, as far as she understood it, likely regarded the depot's contents as Hayes outright, purchase fair and clear at auction, contents included, and no one in town, not even the families themselves, yet knew the state had ever held anything at all. She could have kept the money, could have used it to rebuild the depot into a home and a modest business, could have justified it 100 quiet ways, not least that the world had just taken everything from her and owed her, in its own crooked accounting, at least this much back. She sat with that temptation honestly, for she was not a woman who believed in false virtue, and she let herself feel its pull for the better part of a night before she set it down, gently, the way her father used to set down a tool he decided against using. She thought of her mother walking 2 streets over with a broken kettle to pay Thomas Coyle double what the mend was worth. She thought of Cora slipping $2 into her coat pocket when no one was watching. She understood, with a clarity that felt less like sacrifice and like simple recognition of who she already was, that money taken in silence would never sit as easily in her hands as money returned in the open, and that the depot itself, the actual building, $6 and her own 2 hands, was inheritance enough for a woman who had learned young that everything holds more use than its first appearance grants it. She did not act rashly, though. She was a careful woman, and she understood that a sudden, unexplained windfall of restored money, announced by a stranger the town had laughed at 3 weeks before, would invite exactly the kind of suspicion that might undo the whole delicate work of setting things right. So she spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly verifying every name in Thorne's ledger against town and county records, confirming which families or their descendants still lived nearby, and drafting, in her careful hand, a full and honest account of what she had found and how, so that no one could later claim she had concealed or altered anything. She also began, in those same weeks, the physical work of restoring the depot itself, clearing debris, patching the roof with lumberboard on credit from a mill owner named Hiram Voss who, unlike most of the town, had watched her efforts with quiet respect rather than mockery, and it was this visible labor, this evidence of a woman genuinely rebuilding rather than merely occupying, that slowly began to soften the town's opinion of her even before anyone knew the full truth of what she carried. It was Otis Grady, inevitably, who became the trouble. The same rancher who had mocked her bid on the courthouse steps had, in the years since the depot's collapse, quietly acquired grazing rights on the unclaimed land immediately behind it, land whose boundary had never been properly resurveyed since the depot's original deed, and Grady had operated for a decade under the comfortable assumption that the depot itself would eventually revert fully to the town and the boundary dispute would simply never arise. Adeline's restoration of the depot, and her evident intention to remain and rebuild rather than sell off cheap and move on, threatened that comfortable assumption directly, and when word began to circulate, through no fault of Adeline's own, but through a careless remark by Hiram Voss's clerk, that something valuable had been found inside the old depot safe, Grady saw an opportunity to unseat her before her claim to the property could solidify any further. He went first to Cyrus Bell, the auctioneer, and then to the town council, arguing that the sale had been improperly conducted, that a woman with no clear legal standing, a widow whose own deed to her prior home had been contested, ought not to be trusted with property that might, as rumor now suggested, contain assets rightfully belonging to the town or its founding families rather than to whoever happened to purchase the empty building. It was a clever argument, built on just enough truth to be dangerous, and for a tense week it seemed genuinely possible that the town council, several of whom owed Grady favors or feared his temper, might move to void her purchase entirely and seize the depot and its contents under some hastily constructed civic claim. Adeline did not fight this with anger, though anger was available to her and would have been forgivable. She fought it with the ledger itself. She requested, and was granted, a hearing before the full town council, and she brought with her not only Thorne's original ledger and sealed letter but her own careful witness accounting of every family's rightful sum with interest, along with sworn statements she had quietly gathered from Hiram Voss and from Sarah Pruitt, her landlady, both of whom could attest to the honesty and industry she had shown since arriving in town with nothing. She stood before the council, a woman 3 weeks removed from being turned out of her own home, and read Thorne's letter aloud in its entirety, her voice steady even as more than one council member's face changed color at hearing. For the first time, the true reason the depot had failed and the debt it had silently carried for 20 years. She then stated, plainly, that she intended to return every dollar owed, with the interest Thorne himself had specified, beginning that same week, and that she asked from the council not permission but simply the town cooperation in helping her locate any families whose current whereabouts she had not yet confirmed. Grady, present in the room, attempted once more to argue that the funds ought to pass through some town authority first, a suggestion so transparently self-serving, given his own outstanding grazing dispute, that even his allies on the council fell uncomfortably silent, and it was old Nils Eklund himself, present that day and hearing at last, in Thorne's own written hand, the true fate of his family's lost $30, who rose unsteadily to his feet and said, in his thick, unhurried accent, that he had waited 20 years to be called a fool for trusting this town, and he would not now stand by and let another fool be made of the woman returning what was owed. The council voted, that same afternoon, to affirm Adeline's purchase and her stewardship of the depot in full, and Otis Grady's boundary dispute, quietly investigated in the weeks that followed at the request of Hiram Voss, was found to rest on no valid claim whatsoever, a fact that cost Grady considerably more in the end than his laughter on the courthouse steps had ever cost Adeline. What followed, over the next several months, was not dramatic in the way a story often promises drama, but it was, in its own way, the truest kind of restoration a town can experience. Adeline traveled, when the roads allowed, or sent careful letters when they did not, to every family named in Thorne's ledger, and one by one she placed into their hands sums of money many of them had long since given up as lost, along with a copy, in her own hand, of Thorne's original explanation, so that no family need wonder any longer whether they had been robbed or merely forgotten. Delphine Ruiz wept in her doorway, holding the account of her mother Concepcion's careful $42 faith in a company that had, in the end, honored it 2 decades late through the hands of a stranger who understood exactly what it meant to be doubted. Nils Eklund used his family's return money, at 81 years old, to finally buy the second plow horse he had wanted since 1869, and told his grandchildren a new version of the family story, one about patience rewarded rather than trust betrayed. The Pruitts' $18, returned to Sarah Pruitt as a last surviving family member, went quietly back into the boarding house where Adeline herself had first found shelter, a small circle closing on itself in a way that felt, to everyone who witnessed it, less like coincidence and like the kind of justice the world offers so rarely that people forget to expect it at all. The depot itself, restored through that same season with Hiram Voss's lumber and the labor of townspeople who had begun, almost without announcing it, to simply show up and help, became something more than a private home. Adeline, with a modest remainder of Thorne's returned accounts that no family claimed, families having moved on or died without heirs, established the main hall as a kind of public gathering room and small lending library, the first the town had ever had, stocked initially with her own father's old books on craft and mechanics, sent for from Ohio, and she took in, as a landlady Sarah Pruitt had once taken her in. 2 other women the town's fortunes had left behind, a widow with a young son, and an elderly seamstress whose eyesight was failing, offering them the same plain, dignified shelter she herself had needed 3 months before. Otis Grady, his grazing claim revoked and his reputation quietly diminished by his own greed made visible, sold his ranch 2 years later and left the county altogether, and no one, as far as the record shows, much mourned his going. We began this story by telling you that a 41-year-old woman, cast out with $9, bought a wrecked Stagecoach depot nobody wanted for $6, and that inside its safes had a sealed letter that would change her life and restore something to an entire town. That woman was Adeline Marsh Halloway, and what she found inside that iron box was never simply money, though the money mattered enormously to the families who received it. What she found was a broken promise, 20 years unmended, and what she chose to do with it was the same thing her father had taught her to do with every wounded wheel and warped board that ever came through his shop. She looked past the ruin to the you still waiting inside it, and she did the patient, unglamorous work of setting it right. The town that had laughed at her bid on the courthouse steps came, within a single season, to regard her as one of its steadiest citizens, not because fortune had smiled on her, but because she had refused to let a fortune found in secret remain a secret, and had instead let it do the slow, quiet work of repair that money so rarely gets a chance to do. She lived in that depot for the rest of her days, and it stood, long after her, not as a monument to what she had gained, but as a plain, sturdy reminder that everything holds more use than its first appearance grants it, if only someone is patient enough and humble enough to look. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Adeline's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear tonight that being overlooked is not the same as being without worth. We would love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something, or someone that others had already written off? We read every answer, and we are always glad to have you here with us. Until next time, stay close.